Should I start now? Hello? All right, I'm live streaming. Hi, everyone. All right, we're about to start. It feels weird. I'm like looking here, but everyone's over there. Okay, but I'll just look over there. Okay. So about 3 years ago, my daughter Raquel and I decided we were going to commit and read the entire Bible in 1 year. So 3 years ago, we started one of those Bible reading plans in the YouVersion Bible app that divides it into 365 days. By the end of the year, you're all done. And so we committed to it, and we did it last year, and we're doing it this year again. Although this year, admittedly, I'm falling behind with the schedule. She's really behind, though, so if she's watching, she needs to get caught up. So 3 years we started, and that first year, it felt kind of like a homework assignment because I had to read for about 15, 20 minutes a day, and then you check this little box that you completed your reading, and you move on. But at that pace, and with the length and the complexity of the Bible, I felt like I wasn't really grasping everything. There's so many names, genealogies, time periods, there's so many wars, there's so many things that the only thing I was capturing were the stories and the lessons that I was familiar with. And so it was really just like a homework assignment. And then last year, I started picking up a little bit more, and instead of a homework assignment, it felt more like a routine, like something that I'm doing every day. It was kind of part of my day. And I was capturing a little bit more. Some of the books that I had really not paid attention to before kind of stood out, like Ecclesiastes was a very interesting book that I was interested a little bit more in. Song of Songs was an interesting book, and so I was capturing some of these names. And then this time around, I feel like I'm making better connections with the different parts of the Bible and the depth of the stories. So because my background is, I was an English major with an emphasis in world literature, so I start seeing all this connection from the Bible a little bit more now to a lot of the books that I've read. So even some of the smaller books, like one of my favorite little books is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. You may have heard of it. And the character of the king of Salem in the book, and it reminds me of Melchizedek, which had been a figure in the Bible that I had not really picked up on. By the way, Netflix is coming out with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which I really recommend. And it's pretty much a parallel to the Bible, the more you get to know it. And so now the purpose of my talk is not to convince you to read the Bible, although I do highly recommend it. It's more about the central themes that kind of were my takeaways as I'm reading the Bible. Now, because I'm no expert in the Bible, and I'm certainly not a theologian, unfortunately, I'm not even a deacon. So what I say, comes with just my personal experience. So I'm going to talk about two central themes. If we have time, we'll talk about both of them. The two central themes that I have gotten from the Bible in these past 3 years that I'm participating in these reading plans. So I'll ask you first, if you were to say, what is the central theme of the Bible, like in one word, what would be some of those themes that come to mind? And you can just shout it out. Yeah. Salvation. Salvation, forgiveness. What else did I hear? Love. Okay, what else? Any other theme? One word. Family. Sacrifice. Okay, and those are all good. Now they cheated because they were told beforehand what I was going to say. Sorry, it signed me out. So this is what really stood out to me, was the theme of love throughout the Bible. And one thing that became apparent to me throughout the Bible, and obviously it resonated with me, was the idea of how much just throughout humanity we mess up and God forgives us. We mess up and there's so many times that people in the Bible just mess up and God forgives them. And that certainly rings true to me just personally. So love is the first theme that really stood out to me when reading the Bible, especially in the New Testament. And then the other one is purpose. And that might not seem so apparent at first, but I think, so those two, when I combine them together, love and purpose, were the two that really stood out to me. Now, at first when you hear that, if you're a little bit more cynical, very much a participant, that little child, the idea of love and purpose, if you are more cynical, if you're feeling a little bit more cynical, you may seem like, okay, those are very common words, common ideas. And I think it's because the word love is very often overused, right? I mean, we love like truffle fries and we love our wife. And, you might love, Peter, you love Taylor Swift maybe, and you love your children. Yeah. So we use the love interchangeably with things that are very common day, and then very grandiose, like with God. And then the other idea is, how do we combine this theme of love with our purpose? And that's another term that's overused often, right? The idea of like finding your purpose. But when I'm thinking about love and I'm thinking about purpose, I'm really thinking about it from a day-to-day, normal, everyday life, like you're in the grocery store kind of love. I'm not talking about the big kind of love. So we're going to go into that a little bit. But I guess one first thing we could do is define love. Now, there's so many definitions of it, but the Bible gives us a straightforward definition. And again, I'm not an expert, just kind of what's jumped out at me. So it says, and so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. So God is love. So that's one definition. But again, that may seem really big. God is love. And what does that mean to us on an everyday life? And so I'm thinking back of this college class that I took, where I was taking a psychology class. And the professor was talking about abusive relationships, like psychology and abusive relationships. And he asked us a very interesting question. He said, if someone is extremely abusive to someone, if they're very hurtful in a relationship, can they also love them? What do you think the response was? Yes? Yes? So the professor said, yes, that in their work in psychology, you can love someone and hurt them and be very abusive. And in a way, it did make sense, although I struggle with that, the idea that you can hurt and love someone. But it makes sense because we do at many times just say things, do things that hurt those that we love. Our children, our spouse, our friends, our coworkers, we do those things, right? And so, but I still struggle with it. I think in a clinical sense, which is the way the professor was talking, I think it makes more sense because they're looking at love as a feeling, as an emotion. And if you look at love as a feeling and as an emotion, then it makes sense, right? Because you can have this feeling and another feeling at the same time where you might hurt someone. But my thinking is that in the Bible, love is way more than a feeling. And that really resonated with me as I was reading the Bible, that it's way beyond a feeling. Because if you think of your relationships, like, who's married in here? Now, that feeling of love, is it there all the time? If we're honest? It's 50. Yeah, and that's, you add it up and it's 100%. And so it's, if you relied on that feeling, you might not stay married. You may not stay friends with your old friends, right? It's more an accumulation and the compounding of the actions that we take within those relationships that probably is what adds up to make love, right? And so here's another passage that stood out to me in this context. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Which is, someone mentioned sacrifice earlier, right? So talking about the ultimate act of love. And not only the act of sacrifice, the ultimate act of giving up one's life, but to people who potentially, in the context of this passage, do not deserve it, to sinners. And the willingness to sacrifice for someone else in this context. So really a bigger version of love. And in this passage, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. So again, it would be difficult to say that it's the feeling that we would have that is what God is asking us to do, or a feeling for our neighbor or the people that we work with. It has to be actions. And again, it's the everyday little actions that accumulate. So as we're thinking about, you think about your relationships and how you express love, what are those little actions that people do in your life that really you know they love you? Because people can tell you they love you, but what is it that really makes you feel that love? What would you say? What kind of things do people do? Yeah. Time, effort. What else would they do? Take the garbage out. See, that's what I'm looking for. It's the little things. Like if your children, especially your teenage children, if they take out the garbage, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. So again, it's the little everyday accumulation. But here's the thing, is that our instincts aren't always to do these things. And that's where the tough part is. That's where I think the Bible really speaks. It's how do you fight against your normal everyday instincts, like that person that cuts you off and your instinct reaction, or at the grocery store, the person that may be taking a long time at the cash register. And maybe I'm speaking for myself, but it's those little frustrations, and we have to be awake to those feelings and think, how am I, where am I putting myself in this circumstance? And I think it comes a lot of the times when I'm reflecting on these passages, is that when we put ourselves first in these circumstances, it's my time that's being interrupted, it's my inconvenience, and it's when we do that it makes it difficult to express that love in our actions. And here's another passage, and I know you're all familiar with these. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. So again, this idea of a commandment, so one of the things I want to emphasize is moving beyond that feeling part. Now, and I'll talk a little bit, I'll give an example of that. So I would say that feelings is very small, comparing them to the actions you take, the commitments you make, and the commandments that God gives us. And that if we take these as an obligation and a reflection on our instincts, I think we may be more inclined to love and to behave the way God wants us to. Now I have this little video, and I don't know if it's going to play. And it's okay if it doesn't. Oh, there it is. So, and the reason I think about this, has anybody seen this video? I find this like this is how God probably thinks of us very often, right? So let's see if it plays. We don't need audio. I can explain it. So this father is teaching a child how to hit a baseball on this T-ball. And he's ready to hit it, and he tells him, keep your eye on the ball.
All right, ready, set, swing it. There it is. Remember, keep your eye on the ball. Try it again. Eye on the ball. Swing it. Eye on the ball. Yep, go.
And I think that's how God treats us. He's just like, oh, there you go again. We continue to, I don't know how do I go to the next thing? Oh, there it is. And so I think that's a little funny video that I thought is kind of how God probably looks at us. It's just like, and it just has so much patience with us because we just keep kind of fumbling around sometimes. And he's very forgiving. This is the last passage I wanted to share regarding love because I think this is another one we're very familiar with and probably one that we would struggle with the most, or at least I wouldn't, and that's why I even put it in red letters because it's difficult. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And I think this one's a little bit tougher, and so I'm going to use an example to illustrate this one, and then I'm going to have to brace myself to try to get through this example. So when I was a little kid, like elementary school age, my parents immigrated to the United States. And we first lived with my maternal grandmother. Now, when you guys think of grandmothers, you think of like sweet tetas, tetas, that are very gentle, kind, they want to feed you. So we lived with my grandmother when we first moved in, and she was not like that. She was the opposite of anything you think is gentle, kind. And when my mom and my dad had to go to work, she would be the one that would babysit me. And I'm going to give you one example of how difficult it was to be with her. Now, I was living, her house was in a very rough neighborhood. Like, it was a lot of gang members. It was, it was a very tough neighborhood. And everybody was primarily an immigrant from Mexico. And she was known as Doña Maria. Her name was Maria. But Doña Maria means like, you respect her. Like, even the gang members were afraid of her. And she was this 4'10", very small woman, but everybody feared her. And she made sure, you felt that fear. And I'll give you one example. I'm not going to go the full length, although Maria and other people know this one. But, I was a little kid. I'm in her house. I just came from Mexico. And, of course, I'm following the rules. I'm new at her house, so I'm very cautious of where I go. But, you're a little kid, so you get a little curious. And I start exploring around the house. And I find that there's this cabinet that I open up, and it's full of Oreo cookies and sodas. And I'm this little kid, I'm this chubby little kid, and I see Oreos and sodas, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like a gold mine. So I go over to her, and I pull her apron. She was always in the kitchen or watching soap operas. That was her thing. And I pull on her apron, and I said, Abuelita, grandmother, right? I go, can I have some Oreos and some sodas? And she says, you want Oreos and soda? I said, yeah. She says, no, and don't you ever look at them again. And I said, okay. Now, I'm going to fast forward. I won't give you the detailed version, but it went really bad one day when I decided to go in there anyways. And I got all the Oreo cookies that I can shove in my cheeks and hide away from her. And she caught me. And I won't tell you the details of how it went, but it was bad, right? So anyway, she wasn't a very nice person. And I'll give you a more serious example of how I thought she was very tough, not only on me, but she was very tough on my mom, her daughter. And my grandfather, he stayed in Mexico. And so my grandmother came here on her own. And my grandfather passed away. And my mom was very close with him. Now, my grandmother used to run a bakery, and my mom used to work for her at the bakery. And I remember that day, I was about 7, 8 years old, and I got home, and my mom was devastated, crying. Her father passed away. He's in Mexico. She's here. I remember walking in and seeing her. And then my grandmother says, you got to put yourself together and go to work. You can't stay around all day. You got to go to work. And I remember being 7, 8 years old, and that really striking. My mother was devastated, and she went to work. So she was a very tough person to be around with. So then we moved to our own home. And my mom would still go visit her every single day, like as when we lived at the other place. And I was always wondering, I'm like, she's so mean. Why do you go visit her? And she would go, and she would not explain it to me. She would just go visit her mother. More time went by. Now, my mom doesn't drive, so people would always drive her over there. It was my sister, or I would drop her off. But then after a while, my grandmother became really ill. She started getting dementia, and she went into a nursing home. And my mom would still ask me and my sister to drive her over there to go visit her every single day. Now, I had this resentment for her all the time, and I was like, why do you go visit her? I would just pull up to the parking lot, my mom would go in, and I would wait in the car, because I could not see her. I had that resentment inside me. And then one day, my mom says, hey, can you walk in and, go with me this time? I go, I'd really like you to be in there. I'm like, I don't really want to go. Now remember, this was like the toughest, meanest little woman I ever knew. I had found out that she had never said I love you to my mom. again, very hard woman. So I go in and I see her, and she now has a feeding tube. She is very small. She's very weak. And my mom is sitting with her. She's holds her hand the whole time and just talks to her. And we were there for a good hour, and I still had a difficult time having an emotional connection with her. And I remember my mom was going to say goodbye. She's like, "Mom, I love you," and holding her hand, and she was not responsive. And as we're walking away, my grandmother stands up and tells her, wait, like in a very harsh tone. And she's like, "Yeah, what do you need?" And she's like, "I love you so much." And my mom just broke down crying. And it was an emotional moment for me too. And it was for me because it was such a huge lesson, more than anything, of seeing my mom without any hesitation, always going and visiting her. And I think the follow-up part that I thought was very important is, one thing that I wasn't curious about is, why was my grandmother like that? And I think that's the missing piece. So my grandmother, I found out later, she got married at 15, so she got married very young. My grandfather drank a lot and was an alcoholic. And I found out way later, and in fact just a few years ago, that there were times where he would get so upset when he would drink that he would kick out all the kids out during Christmas, in the middle of the night, at midnight. And she had 9 children. And my mom was telling me this story not too long ago of the older siblings carrying the younger siblings in the middle of the night, going to someone else's home. And I thought, I never took that into consideration when I had those feelings towards her, and not knowing what did she go through. And you've heard you've probably heard the line before that, hurt people hurt people. And so that was something that was very important, not only for me to see my mom as a model of just forgiveness, and she never said she never even felt she needed to forgive her. That's the interesting part. She never felt that she needed to forgive her. She would always tell me, her only response when I would say why do you do that? Why do you go, even though she's like this and that? She would say, "She's my mother and I love her." And that's all she would say. And so for me, that's a big takeaway when it comes to the idea of love, especially when it's difficult. So just a couple takeaways when thinking about love, just some phrases to think about, would be the idea to serve selflessly, which is something that I felt like I really learned looking at an example like that. And active forgiveness, that idea of being curious, the perspective of other people, sometimes that falls away, especially when we put ourselves in front of the situation and say how we're being inconvenienced or how we feel we're being hurt in the situation. And then showing that compassion, those moments where, I think you mentioned also time, giving up your time, those moments that you do those things for other people because that's what they need at those times, even though it may not be our instinct to want to do those. So those are 3 takeaways that I would humbly pass on to you. Are we good on time? Okay. The other idea is the idea of purpose. And this one I find also a very, very important when it comes to God and what I've been hearing as I'm reading the Bible. And here's a passage that I think illustrates what I want to share about this. "You are the light of the world. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." And the reason I think this is important, it's been a good takeaway from me, is that when you're living in your purpose, you're living the will of God. And that whenever you shortchange your abilities in whatever context, then you may not be doing that will of God. And so I'll play a little passage that highlights this.
How do I know? A lot of people, when they think of the phrase, how do I know, they always want to put the what behind it. How do I know what I'm supposed to do? The question that you really should ask is, how do I know why I'm here? Because when you know your why, your what becomes more clear and more impactful. If you know, like for instance, people know that I do comedy, but that's what I do. My why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. So I can do comedy, I can write books, I can be in a movie, because all of it is motivated by my why. In fact, I have a new web series out called Michael Jr. Break Time. We probably just did the 6th episode. It's on YouTube. So every single Wednesday at 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode on YouTube of Michael Jr. Break Time. What it is it's me. I travel around the country and I do stand-up comedy, in case you didn't know. And in the middle of my comedy set sometime, I'll stop and just talk to my audience. And we've been filming this, and it's pretty cool. So we're in Winston-Salem. I'm gonna show you a clip from Winston-Salem. And I'm just talking to this guy in the audience, and he tells me that he's a musical instructor at a school. So I was like, all right, you're a musical instructor, can you sing? Let me hear you sing a song. So this is what happened at the last episode of Michael Jr.'s Break Time. Check it. So you're a musical director? Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now, right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
Let's go. Now. Okay. Here's what I want you to catch. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what becomes more impactful because you're walking towards or in
Your purpose. That's what he was saying. So I like that video and its expression about, following your purpose, but knowing why you're following your purpose. And so I think that video highlights that. And going back to the verse that I had shared about you don't want to put a light under a bowl, I think oftentimes we have a difficult time fulfilling our purpose because we have a narrative around it that prevents us from being able to fulfill it. So we're born, we have this light, but then this narrative is shaped, whether it's because people tell us, what we can or should be, or we start telling ourselves and we limit ourselves. So when you're little and someone tells you, you're not good at math, you may internalize that and, I'm not that good at math, or don't sing, you're a terrible singer. Now you don't sing, you're the clumsy one. And now that story, you're uncoordinated and you tell yourself you can't do this. And then it becomes part of your identity. And that little light just becomes a little darker and darker until it's difficult to be able to express that light. And to give you a more I guess to highlight this point, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Monster Study. So this was a psychology research experiment that was done in 1939 by Mary Tudor, who was a graduate of the University of Iowa. And what she wanted to find out was whether you can teach someone to stutter. And what she did was she went to an orphanage and she asked if she can use the children, and it varied from 5 years old to about 15 years old, to see if they can perform this research study, which you can imagine would be extremely unethical today. And what they did is they separated about 20 children into two groups. One group they called the stutter group. The other group was not the stutter group. And the stutter group, the orphanage staff was instructed to correct them every time they spoke. That every time they made a mistake in speech to say, stop stuttering. Correct that speech. Do not speak unless you can speak properly. And they would be corrected every single time. What ended up happening is that these children from that group started becoming, their self-efficacy started to go down. They would cover their mouth anytime they would speak. Some of them did develop speech impediments because of the reinforcement that was given. Now, you have to realize the important part is that they did not stutter before. But they were told that they were stutterers. They were told to correct something that now became part of their identity. In fact, in 2001, the University of Iowa apologized formally for this study. And in 2007, some of the survivors received a settlement because many reported that the effects of that impacted the rest of their life. And I think this is a strong example of something that sometimes we do to other people when we label them in certain ways. The way we talk to them, the way we make assumptions of what they can and cannot do, which may then, as a result, prevent them from being able to fulfill that purpose. And so it's a dramatic, potentially reminder of the way we can be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about the feedback we provide, whether it's young people, ourselves, especially when we're thinking about a question, and I know it sounds a little existential, the idea of like, who am I? And how often we ask ourselves that question, thinking about who am I and what do I want? And whether these questions are informed by other people, or are they informed by what God wants us to be able to fulfill? And so that's something I pose as a question. Now, for the sake of time, I'll tell you the elephant story some other time, because I know that might take some time. So the author David Wallace has this idea that I try to remind myself of. And I've been in education for about 20 years, and I've worked with children for many years, and I've seen the impact of what happens when their narrative is shifted. And I've seen a lot of success stories too, when children are raised in circumstances that are very difficult, but there's a turning point in their life where that narrative changes and their life improves for the better. I'll give you a quick example about that. And my mom recently, she had a fall. She fell down. And she had to go to the ER. And so fortunately, she didn't hurt herself badly. She had a lot of bruises, but she was in the hospital. And we're there for a few hours because they had to do a lot of tests. And as I'm just standing there, I hear someone say, "Are you Mr. Garcia?" And I turn and I said, "Yeah." And I see this young woman coming in my direction, and I can't recognize her. She's like, I won't say her name, but she told me her name, and then her face came back to me because I was an assistant principal at a school when she was there, and she wasn't the best student. She was often absent, very tardy. She was in my office very often, and she said, "Mr. Garcia, I'm so sorry I made life so difficult for you, and I was so rude to you." And I said, "Well, it looks like you're doing okay now." And she says, "Yeah, I'm a pre-med student now, and I'm working here at the hospital." And I love when I get the opportunity to get those reminders, which don't happen that often anymore because I've been out of the classroom for a while now. But it's this idea that that personal narrative can change. Now, how can we contribute to others that narrative changing or our own. But I'll conclude with this part, which is something that David Wallace, an author, said. He talks about a really short story about a fish swimming in the water, an old fish, an older fish. And he swims by, and these two younger fish swim by. And he asked the younger fish, how are you guys doing? How do you think the water is today? And the fish just say hello, and they swim by. And as they swim by, they look at each other and say, what's water? And the moral of the story is that sometimes we don't know the environment that we're in. We don't know the circumstances of why we do things and the decisions we make. And so thinking about how can we be more awake of our environment, of our actions, may be able to help us in both fulfilling that love as well as fulfilling that purpose. So I'll end there. Thank you. Any questions? Any thoughts?
I wanted to add something that you said earlier about love, and you said that the feelings are small compared to the commitment and obeying the commandments and all these things. And one chapter is kind of like a guidebook of here's what we need to do to make love physical, where it's not emotional, it's a physical response, and that is Corinthians 13. God, right? And if we substitute love for God, that's kind of like the nature of who God is, right? It does not puff up. It does
not
not
boast,
parade
yeah.
itself. So when God is love and we kind of substitute that love for God, we see here is the practicality that we do in our lives that are physical. And so you touched on that was beautiful. And so Corinthians 13 is kind of like that guidebook for that.
Yeah. No, thank you, Henry.
Thank you. This is just a quick recommendation. Book called Soundtracks. I forgot the author. I don't know if you heard of it, but
No, soundtracks?
sounds
Maria,
like
make
a
a
lot
note,
what you're
please.
talking about with the stories we tell ourselves and from a very young age and how we could change. Exactly what you were talking about.
Oh, I love that. That's a perfect title for that. That's good.
Soundtracks.
Thank you. Shall we pray? Thank you.